You here to shoot? Listen, Grandma, knitting needles belong in your hands, not rifles. Lieutenant Ryan Beckett smirked, voice loud enough for the entire training squad to hear. Laughter rippled across the range. In the dry blaze of the Arizona sun, the woman stood still, silver hair tucked neatly beneath a worn straw hat, sun-wrinkled skin, plain plaid shirt and jeans. In her hands, a faded picture frame held like something sacred. No one knew who she was. No one cared. Just an old woman who looked painfully out of place among rifles and roaring soldiers. "This range isn't for relics, ma'am. It's for real shooters." She said nothing. Her eyes drifted past them, locking on the 1,000-yard target blurred by heat waves. Not a flicker of fear. Near the checkpoint, a grizzled sergeant's hand tightened on his rifle strap. His gaze lingered troubled, almost reverent, like he'd seen a ghost he never thought he'd face again. Nobody moved at first. It was like time stuttered for a second. The old woman didn't flinch, didn't explain, didn't retreat. She just stood there, calm, composed, like she belonged there more than any of them. Private Kenny, barely 20, nudged his buddy and whispered, "What's she even doing here?" His voice held the kind of mockery that hides discomfort. Beckett waved it off. "Some Gold Star mom, maybe. Probably thinks she's honoring her kid. Let her take a photo and go." But she wasn't holding a camera. Just that picture frame pressed to her chest like it was keeping her heart from breaking. She stepped forward, slow, steady, like she wasn't crossing a shooting range but a memory she hadn't walked through in years. That's when someone noticed. The gate scanner didn't flash red. It didn't block her. It turned green. Nobody said a word, but everyone saw it. And no one knew what the hell that meant. Usually, when the gate flashes green, it means you're cleared military ID background checks, all the boxes ticked. But that kind of clearance. It wasn't for tourists. The Marines glanced at each other, then back at her. Still no words, no sudden moves. Beckett raised an eyebrow but shrugged it off. "Must be a system error," he muttered, too low for anyone to challenge. The woman didn't even look at the scanner, like she knew it would open, like it always had. She walked past the checkpoint as if it were routine. Her boots, old dusty, made the kind of sound that didn't belong to someone unsure. And then came the smallest moment. Sergeant Carter, retired now base logistics, had been walking by with a clipboard. He stopped cold. His eyes found her face and something in him shifted. He lowered the clipboard just slightly and blinked. Twice. Not in confusion, in recognition. But he said nothing, just watched her go. She didn't ask where to go, didn't look around for directions. Just walked across the concrete past rows of trainees loading mags and adjusting scopes like she'd memorized this layout years ago. A few heads turned. Some smirked. A couple of them nudged each other like she was part of some prank no one had the guts to pull. Beckett was still standing near the command post, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk with something to prove. "She's headed straight for the 1,000-yard line," someone said a little louder than they meant to. Private Kenny chuckled. "Sure, maybe she's here to drop off cookies and wisdom." But nobody was laughing anymore, because there was something off. Not wrong, just off, like watching a stranger walk through your childhood home and knowing exactly where to find the light switches. She moved with a kind of quiet certainty, and suddenly the jokes didn't feel funny anymore. No hesitation, no second guessing. She walked that long stretch of sun-baked concrete like someone who'd walked it in another lifetime, only that time no one had been watching. Her steps weren't fast, but they weren't slow either. Just steady, like she knew where she was going but wasn't rushing to get there. A couple of younger Marines leaned back on a bench near the loading station. One of them called out "Ma'am," the gift shops back at the visitor center. His buddy laughed louder than necessary, trying to impress no one in particular. She didn't even glance their way, didn't flinch, didn't smile, just kept walking frame tight against her chest, eyes locked ahead. That quiet unnerved people more than shouting ever could, because silence, real silence, it only comes from two kinds of people, those who are lost, and those who've already seen too much to explain, and somehow everyone there knew she wasn't lost. The frame in her hands wasn't big. Just worn wood corners nicked the glass, slightly scratched like it had traveled a long way through more than just miles. She held it like people hold folded flags. Not for display, but for survival. By the time she reached the edge of the firing zone, the jokes had stopped. The laughter faded like it never belonged. Beckett stepped forward, arms still crossed, voice still sharp. "Ma'am, I need to ask why you're here. This is an active range, not a memorial." She looked at him for the first time, not with challenge, not with fear, just tired eyes and something deeper. "My son trained here," she said, voice low. "He didn't come home." A pause hung in the air, heavy as sandbags. "I'd like to stand where he used to stand, just for a moment." And for the first time, Beckett didn't have something smart to say. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. Simple, quiet, like she wasn't asking for permission, just stating something the world ought to understand. Beckett shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. This wasn't in the protocol. "I'm sorry for your loss," he managed, defaulting to military manners, "but you can't be here without clearance." That's when she handed him a piece of paper, old, folded sharp like it had lived in her wallet a long time. It wasn't flashy, just a single-page authorization, stamped, signed, and at the bottom in faint type a code neither Beckett nor the range staff recognized. Beckett stared at it for a long second, then looked back at her. "You're not military," he said, more question than statement. She didn't answer, just looked out toward the target field again. "I taught him how to breathe through the shot," she said softly, and for some reason that sentence sent a chill straight through him. There was something in the way she said it. "I taught him how to breathe through the shot. Not how to shoot, not how to hold a gun." She knew the rhythm, the timing, the language. He looked down again at the paper she'd handed him. Clearance code Level 7 Sierra. That was above his pay grade. Way above. He glanced toward the control tower, silently hoping someone else would step in. But everyone up there was watching too, waiting for him to figure it out. Down by the ammo shed, Sergeant Carter was still standing like a statue, clipboard forgotten in his hand. His eyes never left her. She'd turned back toward the range now, eyes on the 1,000-yard targets in the distance. And then, just under her breath, she murmured, "Winds coming from 8 o'clock. Quarter value. Maybe 3 knots. Kenny frowned. "Wait, what did she just say? Because that wasn't something a civilian would say." Beckett didn't respond, but his face had changed. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear, probably. That wind call wasn't for them. It was instinct, like checking the weather before stepping outside, except she wasn't looking at the sky. She was watching the flags on the firing line. Not consciously, just out of habit. There's knowing something, and then there's being wired for it. Back near the utility shed, Private Lee leaned over to Kenny and whispered, "Did she just call wind speed and direction?" Kenny nodded slowly. "Yeah," and nailed it. They both went quiet after that. Meanwhile, she had moved a few steps closer to the bench near the spotting scopes, those usually reserved for instructors or high-clearance observers. She didn't touch anything, just stood there. Then, without looking, reached up and gently adjusted the elevation knob on one of the scopes. 2 clicks. Precise. Confident. And every sniper there knew. You don't do that by accident. Normally, touching equipment on an active military range, especially without a uniform, would get you a warning. Maybe worse. But no one said a word. Beckett opened his mouth, then closed it again. Maybe it was the way she moved, like someone who wasn't trespassing but returning. She stepped back from the scope, satisfied, like a craftsman checking their own tools after a long time away. Then she sat down. Not with hesitation, not like she was asking permission, just quietly, like the bench had been waiting for her. Private Lee swallowed hard. Should somebody tell her?" Kenny shook his head. "You first." And still, no one moved, because deep down every man on that range could feel it now. This wasn't just someone's mother visiting a memorial. There was history here, not in the plaque on the wall kind of way, in the muscle, in the breath, in the calm that only comes from people who fired when it mattered. It started to dawn on them not all at once, but like fog lifting slow. She hadn't come to mourn. Not exactly. There were no flowers, no folded flag, no speech prepared. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was checking something, testing something. Like standing there wasn't about memory, but about readiness. From the control booth, Sergeant Carter was still watching, and something in his posture had changed. His shoulders weren't tense anymore, just heavy. He set the clipboard down, walked toward Beckett, and stopped next to him without a word. "She have ID?" he asked. Voice low. Beckett nodded slightly, pulling the folded paper from his pocket. Carter took one look at the signature at the bottom and froze. His jaw tightened. Then, almost too quiet to hear, he said, "You might want to look her up. Call sign used to be Hawkeye Red." Beckett frowned. "Hawkeye Red? That's not real. That's some old training legend." Carter didn't smile. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why she's sitting here like she never left." Beckett didn't answer. He just stared out at her, suddenly unsure of his own footing. The woman, Margaret. That's what her ID said, was still seated quietly near the firing line. Not interfering, not explaining herself, just there. Like a thread someone had forgotten to pull, and now everything was unraveling. Private Kenny, who'd been the loudest earlier, shifted awkwardly. He wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were. Even the wind had calmed. Back at the tower, Carter crossed his arms. "I heard about her," he said, not looking at Beckett. "Back in Kandahar, before most of these kids knew how to lace a boot." Beckett glanced at him. "Thought she disappeared." "She did," Carter replied, "but not before saving more lives than most of us will ever know." There was a pause. A long one. Then Carter added almost to himself, "Legends don't just disappear. Sometimes they come back to see if we remember what they died trying to teach." Private Kenny kept watching her. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe curiosity. Maybe that strange ache you feel when you realize you've underestimated someone and now it's too late to take it back. She hadn't spoken again. Just sat there, hands resting gently on the old photo in her lap, still as a tree. Quiet, like someone who'd made peace with storms long ago. Kenny shifted his rifle off his lap and let it hang. His earlier jokes felt cheap now. Small. Beckett stepped forward a few paces, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, Margaret, you still haven't told us what you want to do here." She looked up at him slowly. "I just want to see what he saw," she said. Feel the wind he fought against. Hear the silence before a shot. Beckett hesitated, then quietly asked, "Was your son a sniper?" She looked back at the range. He learned from someone who was. The wind picked up again just enough to rustle the flags along the line. Margaret didn't speak right away. She let the question hang there like it wasn't hers to answer quickly. "He was a good shot," she finally said. "But he wasn't fast. He was steady." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly not at Beckett, but at some memory only she could see. "I told him that's what mattered more. Speed fades under pressure. Control stays." Private Kenny had wandered closer now, just listening. Something about her voice made everything around feel quieter. Beckett nodded, half out of respect, half because he didn't know what else to do. "You taught him?" Margaret nodded once. "Long before the Marines did." She traced the edge of the photo with her thumb, soft and slow. "Some things you don't learn in uniform. Some things you inherit in the silence between breaths." She didn't say his name much, just he. Like saying it out loud might undo something she wasn't ready to let go of. "He was 9 when I let him touch his first rifle," Margaret said, eyes still forward. "Too young, maybe. But his hands were steadier than mine." Private Lee, who had stayed quiet up to now, blinked. "Wait, you taught him to shoot?" Like seriously, she gave a small shrug. "Not the way you think. We didn't talk ballistics. We talked breath, posture, focus, learning to hear what the wind was really saying." Lee exchanged a glance with Kenny. That wasn't backyard practice talk. That was real. Margaret looked down at the gravel under her boots. then up at the range again. There's a difference between pulling a trigger and knowing when not to. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because somehow that sentence echoed louder than any rifle on that field ever had. No one had told them to quiet down. No order had been barked. No rule had changed. But something had shifted. The same guys who'd been laughing earlier were now pretending to check gear eyes drifting toward her when they thought no one noticed. Even Beckett wasn't crossing his arms anymore. He looked at Margaret, then down the firing line like he was trying to measure something he couldn't quite name. Private Kenny cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking." What was his name? Margaret didn't answer right away. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper creased and yellowed at the edges, and handed it to him. He opened it slowly. Inside, a commendation handwritten, a name. Staff Sergeant Daniel Lane, KIA, and under it, in smaller print, son of Margaret Lane, Civilian Advisor, Joint Operations Command. Call sign, Hawkeye Red. Kenny looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wait. You're Hawkeye Red." Kenny's words just hung there. Even the wind seemed to pause. Margaret didn't nod, didn't smile, just folded the paper back with careful fingers and slipped it into her pocket like she'd done 100 times before. That silence said more than any confirmation could. Beckett's jaw tensed. He looked at Carter, hoping for denial, some quick correction that would put the whole moment back in its box. But Carter didn't blink. "She trained the teams who trained us," he said quietly, "before most of you were shaving, before half our tech even existed." A long breath passed through the group like a quiet wave. Margaret stood up again, brushing dust from her jeans. "Not out of pride, just habit. I didn't come here to stir memories," she said softly. "I came to leave one behind." And just like that, no one saw her as someone's mother anymore. They saw her for what she'd always been. They just hadn't known where to look. Beckett took a step back. It wasn't retreat, not exactly, more like recalibration. Everything he thought this moment was supposed to be had suddenly changed shape. He looked at Margaret. This woman he'd mocked an hour ago called her a relic, a visitor. And now he didn't even know how to stand near her. "You were in Joint Command?" he asked, quieter than before. She gave a slow nod. "Detached operations, instructional role." "I stayed off record when I could." He swallowed. "Your file? There's not much." That was the point, she said, almost like an afterthought. Behind them, Kenny was still staring, the paper in his hand, shaking slightly. "She's the reason my instructor even knew how to teach wind drift," he muttered. Nobody responded. Because some truths don't need discussion. They don't shout. They just land soft-heavy and stay there, like the kind of shot that doesn't echo. It just never leaves. For a while, no one said anything. Then, Private Lee broke the silence. "Wait." The breathing drills. The 3-second pause. The low whisper commands. "That was her," Carter nodded slowly. "Passed down from team to team. I heard it in Fallujah. Others said they picked it up in Syria. Nobody knew where it came from." Kenny still held the paper, eyes locked on the words like they might rearrange themselves. "I thought it was some old sniper myth. You know, Hawkeye Red sees wind in slow motion." Margaret just smiled faintly. Not proud, not bitter, just tired. People needed stories, she said. Sometimes it was easier for them to believe in ghosts than in a woman with steady hands. Beckett took a slow breath. He wasn't sure when he'd started believing her. Maybe it wasn't about belief anymore. Maybe some truths don't need proving. They just show up one quiet morning and sit on your bench like they've always belonged there. Margaret's voice didn't crack. That almost made it worse. She sat down again slower this time, as if the memory had added years to her legs. "I gave him everything I knew," she said. "Wind, breath, patience, pressure. I taught him how to find stillness inside noise." Her fingers tightened slightly around the photo frame. "But I didn't teach him how to carry it." She looked up, not at anyone in particular, just into the air where her son might still be listening. I thought if he shot like I did, he'd survive like I did. A pause. But some of us didn't survive. We just never died. No one dared interrupt her. Even Beckett stood frozen arms hanging at his sides. Because in that one sentence she'd said the thing most of them had never put into words. And once it was spoken, it didn't leave the room. The photo sat quietly in her lap, face down now, as if it had said all it needed to. Margaret rested her palms on her knees, steadying herself not from age, but from what was coming. "I haven't touched a rifle in 12 years, she said mostly to herself. "Not since he—" She stopped, took a breath. "I left it behind. The range, the teams, the name." Beckett stepped forward, cautious now. Then, why come back? She looked at him, not sharply, not accusingly, just honestly. "Because I taught him how to stay calm under fire." Another breath. "But I never showed him what comes after, and I can't ask him now." A pause settled soft as dust. "I came to stand where he stood, to pick up what I left, so I can finally put it down the right way." And in that moment, no one doubted her reason for being there anymore. She stood up without a word. Not with ceremony, not with pride, just quiet resolve. The kind that comes from someone who didn't need to ask permission, only forgiveness. Her knees cracked softly and someone nearby instinctively stepped forward thinking she needed help. She waved them off gently. "I'm fine." Then she turned toward the firing lane. Every movement was unhurried, like she wasn't walking toward a target but toward something deeper, something left undone. Beckett didn't speak, neither did Carter, and none of the younger soldiers dared break the silence. It wasn't reverence exactly. It was recognition, of loss, of weight, of something too heavy to name but too familiar to ignore. Margaret walked until she reached the resting stand where a rifle had been prepped for morning drills. She didn't touch it, not yet. She just looked at it the way someone looks at an old friend they once knew better than themselves. And for a second, she didn't look old at all. Margaret stood in front of the rifle for a long moment. She didn't reach for it right away. Her eyes studied it, not checking the model or the scope, but remembering. The way hands used to move, the way silence used to sound when it was full of purpose. The rifle wasn't hers. Not technically, but it might as well have been. Same weight, same build, same cold steel that once felt warm only because her son's fingers had touched it too. She placed both hands gently on the table, not to steady herself, but to ground the ache rising in her chest. Behind her, not a word. Even the usual clinks and clicks of the range boot's mag scopes had stopped. She looked out toward the 1,000-yard target. The mirage shimmered in the heat, but her gaze didn't waver. "He used to say this distance calmed him," she whispered, "because everything else fell away." And somehow they all understood exactly what she meant. Margaret reached for the rifle not quickly, not ceremoniously, just deliberately. Her fingers wrapped around the grip with a kind of familiarity that made a few Marines shift on their feet. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Like watching someone pick up a photograph they hadn't been able to look at in years. She brought the rifle close, held it across her chest, not like a soldier, but like a mother holding something her son once carried. A breath slipped out of her almost soundless. Not relief, not tension, just release. From behind, Private Kenny whispered, "She's done this before." Beckett didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that moment they all saw it. Not in how she held the rifle, but in what she didn't have to do. No show, no stance, just a woman standing at the edge of something she hadn't finished living through, and now, finally, choosing to face it. Margaret lowered herself into position with surprising ease. Not robotic, not stiff, just practiced, like riding a bike you haven't touched in 20 years and your body still remembers the balance. The mat beneath her was hot, the rifle heavier than she recalled, but she didn't complain. She just adjusted, slowly, deliberately, until the buttstock rested against her shoulder like an old friend. From behind, the soldiers watched, still silent. Some of them didn't even know why they were holding their breath. She looked through the scope, but didn't speak, didn't rush. Her breathing settled. Long inhale, pause, long exhale, again. Out at the 1,000-yard target, the desert shimmered. Nothing had changed, and yet somehow everything had. Because this wasn't about the shot. Not anymore. It was about whether she could see clearly through the ghosts that once stood between her and the crosshairs, and whether she wanted to. Through the scope, the world narrowed. The heat blurred the edges, but Margaret wasn't looking for edges. She was looking for something else, a flicker, a sign, a reason. The crosshairs floated steady, trained on the target she had no intention of destroying. Not yet. She blinked once, then again. But it wasn't sweat stinging her eyes, it was memory. Her son's voice, soft and laughing. "Mom, you breathe like a sniper when you're mad at the GPS." And her own reply. "Maybe that's because I used to be one." She hadn't meant to say it then, but it had slipped out like the truth always does, quiet and inconvenient. Margaret's finger hovered near the trigger, but she didn't squeeze, because this wasn't about the bullet or the target. It was about the moment right before. The one that asks, "Are you ready to let go?" And she didn't know the answer. Not yet. Nobody moved. Not the officers, not the youngest recruits, not even the base commander standing off to the side with folded arms and clenched jaw. They all waited. But it wasn't the kind of wait filled with tension or drama. It was sacred. Margaret still hadn't taken the shot. Through the scope, she saw the paper target dancing slightly with the breeze. Just enough to make it real. Just enough to remind her this wasn't just about precision anymore. It was about permission. Permission to be more than what they thought she was. More than what she thought she was. And then, from somewhere behind her came a voice. Soft, familiar. "Take your time." It was Beckett. But maybe it was also someone else, because in that moment it felt like the words didn't come from just a man, but from memory, from grief, from healing itself. And Margaret exhaled, slow, deep, the kind of breath you take before deciding who you're going to be. Margaret blinked once more. The breath she held slowly slipped from her lips. Then, without drama, without flair, her finger moved. The shot rang out. Clean, precise, like punctuation at the end of a long, unsent letter. 1,000 yards away, the target snapped once dead center. Bullseye. But Margaret didn't react. No smile, no pride. She stayed in position, eyes still in the scope as if waiting for something else to break. Something inside her. When she finally sat up, she looked older, and yet lighter, as if one shot had lifted something she'd been carrying for years. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the rifle, set it down gently, almost like placing a flower on a grave. Then she stood and just said, "That's enough." Not to the Marines, not to the weapon, but to herself. Because sometimes peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from doing something, once, and knowing you never need to again. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the shot still echoed somewhere far off, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Margaret stood tall, but her eyes were softer now. Not defeated, just at ease. Around her, the crowd slowly shifted. Phones were tucked away. Arms crossed earlier in judgment now hung awkwardly at their sides. Even Colonel Briggs, stone-faced all morning, looked down, his lips pressed thin as if chewing on guilt he couldn't quite swallow. Private Reyes was the first to move. He stepped forward and simply said, "Ma'am." "Thank you." Not for the shot, but for showing them something they didn't expect to see. A warrior who didn't need to prove she could kill, only that she could walk away. And as the others followed, nodding quietly, something changed in the air. Respect wasn't demanded that day. It was earned and returned, just like Margaret had returned to herself. That evening, Margaret walked alone back to the small bench beneath the rusted plaque at the range's edge. She sat in silence, tracing the etched name with her fingers, Evelyn Harper, Eagle 1, her mother. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting the desert in gold. Footsteps approached. It was Sergeant Hill, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. Margaret took it, nodded, and said softly she would have hated the drama. Hill chuckled. Yeah, but she'd be proud of the ending. Margaret smiled, small but true. Then, watching the range fade into dusk, she added, I used to think walking away meant weakness. Now, I think it means you've carried enough. Behind her, the range lights flickered off one by one. She didn't look back, because some wars aren't meant to be won, just laid down gently, and finally left behind.